The life of any great artist is defined by failure just as much as success, perhaps more so. If you were to take a close look at the career of any filmmaker you admire, you'll find highs and you'll find lows. You'll find triumph and you'll find defeat. What makes a great artist great is not that they never fail, it's that they never give up. Terry Gilliam, one of my personal favorite directors, is, in some ways, the epitome of this. His work never finds its way on screen without a fight. It's defiantly original, it's gleefully eccentric, and it's always, unmistakably, an expression of personal, singular vision. The only reason he's been able to continue doing that for as long as he has is because he's cultivated an unusual capacity for constant practical compromise and fierce, stubborn perseverance. And even then, for every one he's carried through to completion, he's had to leave behind many more that will remain forever abandoned and unfinished. Creative triage is an all too common necessity in the film industry, and Gilliam's performed it countless times. As human beings, we have limited time and limited energy, so it makes sense to focus those resources onto whatever project has the best shot at being realized at any given time. Sometimes a film defies the odds, like The Man Who Killed Don Quixote, but that is certainly the exception and not the rule. Provided here is a relatively brief overview and chronological presentation of some of my favorites among Gilliam's many abandoned projects. A few of these have such involved histories that to truly do them justice, I'd have to give them their own episodes, which, who knows, I may do at a later date. Gormenghast is one that dates from the time before Jabberwocky, Gilliam's first film as a solo director. A lover of fantasy and medieval fiction, Gilliam first read the Gormenghast trilogy of books in 1976 and was captivated by the world they created. Written by author Melvin Peake, the trilogy, sometimes declared by fans to be better than Lord of the Rings, is made up of the works Titus Groan, published in 1946, Gormenghast from 1950, and Titus Alone from 1959. Peake was apparently in the process of writing a fourth book before his life was cut short by Parkinson's disease in 1968. Gilliam, who responded most strongly to the middle book in the series, Gormenghast, loved the story's dilapidated castle setting and its strange collection of characters. Unfortunately, so did a lot of other people. The rights to the books never seemed to be available, constantly trading hands between big names like Peter Sellers and later Sting. Jabberwocky, made in 1977, took a not insignificant amount of influence from Gormenghast, being set itself in a dilapidated castle populated by oddballs. Funnily enough, over subsequent years, Gilliam actually found himself being courted as director for the project more than once by different rights holders, though he had, by then, lost interest. The books were eventually adapted by the BBC in 2000 as a television serial. One curious side note before we move on, there's one other project that predates Jabberwocky that I'd like to mention. It was a rather bizarre job offer Gilliam received for something called All This and World War II. Ostensibly a comedy, the film was supposed to be made up of genuine newsreel footage of World War II, cut to a soundtrack of Beatles music, all covered by famous musicians. Gilliam turned the offer down, but believe it or not, this film was actually made in 1976. Directed largely by rock documentary veteran Tony Palmer and ultimately credited to Susan Winslow, All This and World War II was a critical and financial disaster, getting yanked from theaters after only 2 weeks. Though it's never been released on home media, it has a rather fascinatingly troubled production history, and I've read rumors that National Lampoon was involved with it at some point, that Christopher Guest, Bill Murray, and even John Lennon were allegedly screened some footage and asked to contribute ideas. And I guess there's even some controversy over whether Gilliam was ever actually associated with it, since the guy who conceived the thing, Russ Regan, has flat out said Terry Gilliam was never asked. The book Dark Knights and Holy Fools by Bob McCabe states otherwise. See, Gilliam's producer on Jabberwocky was Sandy Lieberson, also producer of cult classics like Nick Rogue and Donald Cammell's Performance. Ken Russell's Lisztomania, as well as, that's right, all this and World War II. Lieberson first got into contact with Gilliam to offer him that gig. Theseus and the Minotaur is one Gilliam has pursued a couple times over the decades, the earliest attempts dating back to the era of Time Bandits in 1981. Theseus was tossed around as a potential follow-up to Jabberwocky, along with an early version of Brazil Gilliam was toying with. He couldn't get either of those projects off the ground at the time, and eventually, the idea for Time Bandits developed. Looking at that one, you can really see the mythological influence there, clearly sparked, at least in part, by Gilliam's interest in Theseus. The story would re-enter Gilliam's life in 1996, shortly after 12 Monkeys. He started working on a Theseus and the Minotaur screenplay that was said to be quite large and ambitious, exploring the rise and fall of civilization and positing a version of the mythological hero who, over the course of the story, finds his simplistic definitions of good and evil being challenged as he grapples with the increasing moral ambiguity of his own actions. This screenplay was one of Gilliam's first collaborations with writer Tony Grisoni, with whom he would later write the scripts for Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, Tideland, and The Man Who Killed Don Quixote. The director got as far as scouting some locations for the film in India, when it was rumored to be his next project after Fear and Loathing. Theseus was eventually set aside in favor of The Man Who Killed Don Quixote, or the first version of it at least, in 1999. Since then, Gilliam appears to have left it largely on the back burner, though it does get brought up once in a while. The last mention of it I could find was from 2009, when he was doing press for The Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus. He seemed to sum up the project's status simply and succinctly by saying, "The script has never been ripe." Gilliam spent a lot of years circumnavigating Hollywood, his first occasion having to confront it directly being the time Universal Studios threatened to recut his 1985 masterpiece, Brazil, for American audiences. Gilliam embarked on a war of attrition with the studio, and amazingly, he won. This saga is recounted in Jack Matthews' great book, The Battle of Brazil. By 1989, however, the fervently independent Gilliam was doing the unthinkable, signing to a Hollywood agent and hunting for a studio job. Why the change of heart? To put it simply, he was in crisis. The Adventures of Baron Munchausen, his 1988 effects-laden spectacular, had spiraled colossally out of control. The film ran catastrophically over budget and was arguably plagued by more production disasters than even the infamous Quixote. Yet miraculously, it was never shut down. Gilliam completed it, released it to critical acclaim, and watched, horrified, as it vanished at the box office without a trace. A real shame because the movie is so enchanting. The whole experience nearly broke him. It's a saga of its own, which you can also read about in another great book, Andrew Ewell's Losing the Light. In the aftermath, Gilliam, worn down, depressed, fearing for the future of his career, turned to Hollywood for salvation. The lifeline he grasped onto was a doozy. The film adaptation of Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons' pioneering graphic novel, Watchmen. Joel Silver, the producer behind action hits like Die Hard and Lethal Weapon, had acquired the rights and was looking to adapt the material as a big-budget blockbuster. Now, Watchmen has a long history of development hell that extends far beyond Gilliam, best covered in full with its own episode. My comments here will be broad. Gilliam's involvement happened pretty early in the process. Sam Hamm, the writer of Tim Burton's Batman, had taken a crack at the screenplay, which Gilliam was unimpressed by. He and Charles McEwen, his co-writer on Brazil, got to work crafting their own script, with the goal of preserving its darkness and complexity. Immediately, they discovered what a serious challenge they were in for. Figuring out how to properly condense Moore's intricate plot, his complicated characters, his thematic density, into something that might work as a 2-hour movie was no easy task. According to Gilliam, they never got a chance to adequately solve the script's problems before the film collapsed. Silver was unable to raise the money, somewhere in the neighborhood of $40 million, pretty hefty for the time, and he eventually lost the rights. It would be many years before it was finally brought to theater screens in 2009 by Zack Snyder, who who I think did a hell of a job, though the film continues to polarize fans. Silver did an interview in 2014 where he shared some details of the Gilliam version, which would have apparently climaxed with Dr. Manhattan traveling back in time to prevent his own creation, which results in some kind of reality distortion that concludes with the characters realizing they are no longer real, only characters in a comic book. It's also possible he's confusing this with Sam Hamm's draft, since in the chapter on Watchmen in David Hughes' The Greatest Sci-Fi Movies Never Made, it mentions that Hamm came up with a similar variation on the story's twist ending. The whole thing sounds interesting, but whatever direction Gilliam was planning on taking with it remains vague, since he never completed his work on the script. Although I've heard rumors he came back to the project in 1996, I'm not sure they're accurate. In the 90s, Gilliam really started stepping outside his comfort zone. This was his Hollywood period, when he started wondering if there might actually be a place for him within the conventional industry. The experiment began optimistically, but it ended at the close of the decade, with Gilliam returning to the fringes and independence. Those first few years, however, were filled with potential, as Gilliam eagerly loaded his plate with development deals, following his first high-profile success, The Fisher King, in 1991. It only served to bitterly remind him how frustrating he found this town, when almost all of those deals inexorably crumbled before his eyes. Of the enormous number of projects he became associated with at this time, only 3 films actually resulted. That was the same number he had managed to make the previous decade, before trying to embrace Hollywood. Much of that time spent in limbo would revolve around one specific idea, one that still hasn't left him all these years later. It was called The Defective Detective. Initially planned as his follow-up to The Fisher King, Gilliam wrote it with the writer of that film, Richard LeGravenese. The story followed a middle-aged, burnt-out private eye in New York, hired to investigate the disappearance of a little girl. His investigation reveals the girl has somehow vanished inside an elaborate fantasy world. When the cynical, depressed PI is spirited away to this place himself, he's hurled through a series of incredible adventures that allow him to slowly rediscover his childhood innocence. Eventually, the detective is called upon to become this world's unlikely savior. It was essentially a direct continuation of the central theme of Brazil and Munchausen, one Gilliam has returned to many times. What happens when fantasy and reality are forced to collide? Defective Detective would have explored this on the largest possible scale. Gilliam planned to pack the film with a level of visual spectacle that would rival anything in his greatest achievements, even recycling sequences that proved too technically challenging from his previous films to use here. It became something of an albatross, his never-realized attempt to utilize the machinery of Hollywood in service of something pure Gilliam. He first put it together with Nick Nolte in 1993, then he resurrected it with Bruce Willis after 12 Monkeys in 1995. Then it nearly came together again in 1996 with Nicolas Cage. Then Bruce Willis offered to step back on board in 1999. Always there were reservations from the studios over the unorthodox material, and endless problems with the budget. After Gilliam left Hollywood behind for good, he appeared to leave Defective Detective behind with it, only to supplant it with another albatross, The Man Who Killed Don Quixote. For the next 20 years, Quixote would consume most of his attention. It was the one that always drew him back, determined to live against all odds. Defective Detective lived on, mostly in spirit. Pieces of it are said to have popped up now and again in his post-Hollywood work, in films like Tideland and Dr. Parnassus, stories also dealing with latent imaginary worlds. Defective Detective, as a film itself, was indeed laid to rest, but it had a second life awaiting it. Television was seeing some enormous artistic and commercial breakthroughs in the 21st century, and Gilliam, around 2015, was inspired to rework Defective Detective as a 6-part miniseries. Amazon may have picked this series up at one point, as part of their deal to help produce and distribute Gilliam's Quixote. Sadly, that whole deal was nixed after Gilliam started getting hit with lawsuits from Paulo Branco, a former producer of the project. This situation is its own can of worms, something for another episode. The Man Who Killed Don Quixote, a film much better than I think it was given credit for, was finally completed in 2018. Gilliam had gotten one of his greatest burdens off his back after all these years, though he would spend another year stuck in court battles with Bronco, who tried to block the film's release. Eventually, he would triumph even over that nightmare. Quixote's release spelled the end of an era for him, leaving the director in a strange position. After accomplishing the impossible, you have to wonder, what do you do next? He's been at something of a loss trying to answer that question. Currently, Gilliam is weighing his options. Defective Detective, one that's been with him about as long as Quixote, remains on the table, still as a possible miniseries. He's talked about taking it to Netflix, but it doesn't sound like there's any guarantee it'll be the one he tackles next. Whatever happens, it looks like Gilliam, now 79 years old, still has some fight left in him.